Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Chris Shang, and today we have Matt Dixon, who's the founding partner of DCM Insights. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Of course. Yeah, doing well. Thank you. Yeah, tell us a little bit about DCM. What do you guys do? What kind of company do you guys work with, and go from there.
Yeah, sure. So we are a research company. DCM was founded as what we call the Customer Understanding Lab. So really kind of designed to understand changes in the client buying environment, and then what are the best salespeople, marketing departments, organizations doing to kind of meet customers where they are. Because I think one of the things we know about customers is they tend not to stay put. They change the way they engage with companies, what they expect of salespeople. The bar keeps moving up. And so what we've chartered the company to do is really to stay abreast of that, made ideally one step ahead of the of where most salespeople are, where most commercial organizations are. We take our insights and then we put them in or deliver them to companies in a variety of forms. So everything from keynote presentations and workshops to sales training for both B2B sales organizations. So think about kind of product or productized solution kind of sales organizations. We also work with advisory organizations, so meaning professional services firms. So people who basically sell advice for a living. Think about like lawyers, accountants, consultants, investment bankers, search executive recruiters, and search professionals, and the like.
Got it. Very cool. Sounds super interesting. Definitely a lot to dive into around that
Mhm.
topic. I think just because Uh, I definitely feel like the past couple of years leading till now has changed a lot in terms of, especially like on the B2B side of
For
things of
sure.
how
Yeah.
people buy. But
Yep.
before we do that, how did you get into this space in the very beginning? What was your initial interest in sales, and yeah, how'd you land into it?
Yeah, it's probably a better to be lucky than good kind of story. I actually, after undergrad, mainly because I wasn't really interested in having a kind of a steady job or a regular job, I took an appointment to go into a doctoral program. So I was in a PhD program for about 5 years after I graduated college, studying political economy, actually, which has almost nothing to do with what I do today. Although a lot of the research techniques I learned in grad school, I apply to what I do today. After grad school, I went to go work for a company. I spent almost 20 years at a company called CEB, which was in 2017 acquired by Gardner Group. And most of my time was spent there managing and leading the research team that focused on sales, customer experience, and I had an industry vertical practice as well in financial services. But as far as my interest in sales, it's interesting because I guess I would say, most folks who write about sales or speak about sales are themselves salespeople or former sales leaders. That is not me. I guess, a sales anthropologist. So I've never been a salesperson. I've never led a sales team. I'd say I support salespeople, but I'm more write about sales than actually do sales. But I think what makes me unique is I, again, bring a background of research and research backed methods to study changes in customer buying behavior and what the implications are for salespeople. So, I often tell teams that are looking to bring in, let's say a keynote speaker for a sales kickoff or to train their teams, that look, I'm not going to tell you what worked for me personally because I've never been in your shoes, but I will tell you what thousands and thousands and thousands of the world's best salespeople are doing differently and what we can learn from those people and kind of import into our own practice as sales professionals.
Super interesting. Um, so then how did you get from your area of expertise in grad school and then going into research side of things? And I
Mhm.
mean, I feel like you could have gone into a lot of different realms with that
Yeah, yeah.
background. Why sales or understanding the customer journey?
I think it was honestly it was when I ended up at CEB. Actually, my first stint was working in the technology research group, and I think concluded pretty quickly when I could barely operate my own computer that I probably shouldn't be giving advice to CIOs and CTOs of big large enterprises. I spent a period of time doing research for the company, so I was doing new product development, corporate strategy research. And then when I went back into kind of the line, if you will, or to the research part of the business, in 2016, one of the openings where we were looking for a new leader to take the helm was in the sales practice. And I think it's funny because I actually interviewed with that practice back in, I think it was 99 when I started with the company. And I didn't really have a lot of interest in sales. And I think a lot of that, to be honest, was probably because of the pejorative connotation that Hollywood has given salespeople. Sales is like it's sleazy, it's pushy, it's aggressive, it's obnoxious. And I didn't really want anything to do with that. It was only many years later that I realized that it's a phenomenal opportunity for researchers like myself. I think there's more data that is collected about sales interactions. There's more potential for study there, but ironically, if you pick up the average sales book, there's actually very little data in it. It's a lot of personal opinion, a lot of anecdotal evidence. There's a lot of conventional wisdom and kind of passed down folklore in sales, despite the fact that there's all this data and opportunity for study. And so I thought it was just kind of an interesting challenge to bring data to a profession that had largely been governed by kind of conventional wisdom and passed down kind of folklore and advice from folks who had preceded us as sales professionals.
Interesting. Uh, I'd be curious as to, in that journey, what has been some of the things that you've either been able to validate or disprove
Mhm.
around that folklore versus as
Yeah.
it relates back to tangible data?
Yeah, it's so I think our my team over the years has put out a couple of studies that have actually made their way into places like Harvard Business Review and in the form of some books. I think one of the best known examples, maybe I'll give you two examples. One that goes a ways back, and one that's actually pretty recent. So if we go back to 2011, that's when we published a book called The Challenger Sale.
Mhm.
And that book we actually just learned the other day just crossed 1 million copies that have been sold
Wow.
worldwide, which is kind of mind blowing for me because that's not we didn't write it with the intent of selling 1 million copies of the book. But
Congrats.
I think the reason it took off was because we challenged this conventional notion that sales is all about relationships. In sales is all in modern sales is really about trying to understand what's keeping your customer up at night, what's called solution selling. This is kind of the gold standard of B2B sales in the modern age. And what we found was that all salespeople, and this is based on a large database study of I think ultimately it was like 250,000 salespeople that we have data on, could be placed into one of five different selling profiles. One of those profiles was what we call the relationship builder, who is very reactive and responsive and wants to know what's keeping their customer up at night and address those needs for the customer. We actually found the winning profile was a profile called the challenger, as the title of the book suggests. The challenger is a very different kind of salesperson. They believe that they see their objective or their goal with the customer not to understand what's keeping them up at night, but rather to show them what should be keeping them up at night. Because what the challenger knows is that in today's world where customers are inundated with information and they're doing tons of research and due diligence before they ever pick up the phone and call a salesperson. In fact, we found in our research, the average customer is 57% of the way through the buying journey before they ever pick up the phone and ask for a meeting with the supplier or the sales rep from the
Yeah.
company that they're considering partnering with. And that puts salespeople in a really tough spot, right? The customer's already decided what they're trying to do. They've decided that you can fit their needs. They decided, about how much they want to pay for your product or solution. And then they force you to compete on price against the other companies they've also concluded could probably do a good job as well. It's a really tough place for the salesperson to be. But what challengers have realized is that what you need to do is basically undo that learning. You need to bring the customer those ideas and insights, the things they couldn't learn on their own, right? The things that you as a salesperson or supplier know that the customer needs to know, and start the conversation there in a way that kind of reframes their own understanding of what's right answer for their company. So that was kind of a head snapping insight, I think, that has fueled a ton of conversation, fueled a lot of debate. And a lot of companies have then taken this model and deployed it in their sales organization. I mean, you can go to LinkedIn today and people will brand themselves as like challenger salespeople, or they were trained in the challenger methodology. And that's, again, very gratifying to see. And to have people come back many years later now, more than a decade later, and say, boy, that changed my trajectory as a salesperson. I was kind of a mediocre performer or even a low performer. And when I realized that today's customer is really looking for those provocative ideas that change the game for them, I suddenly felt liberated and I could go engage customers in the way that I knew I could, where I could deliver value. And then I saw my results and my customers' results respond in turn. So that was back in 2011. And then more recently, we wrote a book called The Jolt Effect. It came out in 2022. For that book, we collected 2.5 million recorded sales conversations. And the book is about the problem of no decision losses. And these are like the bane of the salesperson's existence. This is when the customer says, Chris, love what you're talking about, love your product, love your solution. Let's start talking about a proposal and let's start, running the traps and get, putting ink on the contract. And then they ghost you, right? They go radio silent, they get cold feet, and they just kind of disappear. And this happens a huge percentage of the time. We found that anywhere between 40 and 60% of the average salesperson's qualified pipeline will ultimately be lost to no decision. So it's a huge dead weight loss for a salesperson. But what we learned in this study of 2.5 million sales calls that we conducted is that most salespeople, when the customer starts to get cold feet and hesitate, they kind of break out their hammer and they go to town on the customer, because what they've been taught to believe for many years is that the reason the customer's not moving forward, the reason they're becoming hesitant, is they're kind of stuck in their status quo, right? They're suffering from status quo bias. And we know that it's hard to get people to change, especially hard to get customers to change. And sometimes they'll talk themselves back into their status quo, right? And so what salespeople tend to do is they break out what we call the FOMO set of techniques. They try to reconvince the customer how great the product is. They try to scare the customer into taking action by saying, hey, these problems are, Chris, these problems in your company, they're not going to fix themselves. And check out all your competitors who use our product and they're experiencing tremendous benefits. And you guys are getting left in the dust. And if those things don't work, I usually dangle like a 10% discount that's only good this week, like right in front of you, try to get you to sign, right? But really what I'm trying to do is dial up that fear of missing out. But what we found the very best salespeople do, and something that they've realized that average salespeople don't, is it's not the customer, your inability to dial up the FOMO, the fear of missing out with the customer, that prevents them from moving forward. It's actually your inability to dial down what we call the FOMO. The FOMO is the fear of messing up. And this is rooted in a powerful psychological concept known as the omission bias, which is the desire of people to avoid blame and to avoid being personally responsible for things going wrong. Making a decision to buy from a certain vendor and then having that all go sideways. And so this is a very powerful concept for salespeople to understand. And we, in the Jolt Effect, we talk about the playbook that best salespeople use to instill customer confidence, to get the customer feeling better about the decision they've made and working with us as a vendor, and the fact that we're not going to leave them holding the bag, but we've got their back and they're going to look like a hero, not like a fool. So the message to salespeople is like, look, there's a time during the sale to push and to dial up the FOMO and to break the customer's status quo bias. But after that's accomplished, the next thing you got to do is basically put your arm around the customer's shoulders and say, it's going to be all right. I'm going to make you look like a hero. Trust me, I've got your back. And that's a very different kind of motion. It's a very different set of skills and techniques, one that most salespeople have never been taught to deploy with customers. So again, those are two examples of where we've been able to use data. I mean, trust me, we found a lot of things that salespeople do, it turns out, are right. The conventional wisdom is right. But in a few pretty big spots, we found that it's a little bit lacking or a little bit off. And so when we find those things, we will go out and publish them, put them in book form, create training programs around them in the hopes of trying to help salespeople to up their game. And again, deal with today's customer buying behavior.
Yeah, you cover a lot of points there. I feel like one of the ones that um that you just kind of like covered towards the end of that conversation was, at least anecdotally, I've heard a lot of that kind of being the trend now, which is, involving the onboarding or customer success or whatever that
Mm-hmm.
next stage is post sign contract,
Yep.
as earlier into the sales conversation as
Mm-hmm.
possible, because that does instill the confidence
Yeah.
that you're not left holding the bag. Because I feel like, especially for earlier stage companies, that's
Mm-hmm.
probably like the biggest hurdle, is what I see, is that you do not make it easy for the buyer to buy. And
That's right.
and whether that's like understanding what the solution does to,
Yep.
all right, I agree, I need to have this, but then, like, again, left holding the bag with a 6 month onboarding implementation time that then turns into a year long and becomes a very frustrating and infuriating process.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to, as somebody who's looking at the data side of things, um, have you noticed that become more thematically true in
Mm-hmm.
recent years, or has that been something along the course of your career covering this topic noticed to be always there. I'm
Yeah.
just curious as to,
It's
has there been themes or
that's a
trends that have
great
been popping up?
yeah, that's a great question, Chris. I mean, we somebody else asked me I was doing a keynote. We did kind of a fireside chat with me and the chief revenue officer of the company. And one of the things he asked me, which I really stumped me because I've been asked this question before, but I don't really know that I have a great answer, which is this something that's always been out there and we just never knew, right? So think about like that the telescope they put like a million miles past the moon, it can now take pictures of the galaxy far, far away, and it's like, holy cow, it's been there for millions of years. We just never had the technology to find it. Or is it that these things are actually new, or that they are actually on the rise? And I think it's a little bit of both, honestly. The way we did the research, at least in the Jolt effect example, the Jolt effect, collecting 2.5 million sales calls and studying them with machine learning and AI, that's just technology that didn't exist before. So we just never had the capability to study the sales conversation with that level of precision or at that kind of scale. But at the same time, I think, if we look at that research, we find that there are really three big things that are driving customer indecision or customer hesitancy. The first one is when customers are presented with too many options. And think about this, every supplier out there, every vendor out there is offering all kinds of bells. You got your roadmap items, you got all the features and capabilities, you got all the different contract links, you got the partner integrations, right? We love letting 1,000 flowers bloom with our customers because we believe that we want to be able to say yes to any need that they articulate to us, right? We want to be able to address that. And so we throw all these options their way. I mean, there are very few suppliers, if any, that I could name that are trying to limit the number of options they're giving their customers. It's nobody's going to the Henry Ford model of like, you can have any car as long as it's black. Like that's not where we're going. We're going towards more options and more capabilities. The second big thing that customers get hesitant about is having to sift through too much information to make a vendor or product selection decision. And you think about it, in any space, around any industry, any technology, there is more written every minute of every day than there was, the day before, right? In some industries, you could literally fill like an NFL stadium with all the content out there, the white papers, the webinars, the proof points, the case studies. I mean, and a customer is never going to be able to navigate their way through all of that, but they are deeply afraid of some new piece of information coming to light after the decision is made that makes it look like they didn't do their homework, and maybe now they've got egg on their face, right? They didn't leave no stone unturned. They didn't do all the homework like they should have. And then lastly, the third big driver of customer hesitancy is their fear that they're quite literally not going to get what they're paying for, right? They're not going to see the full ROI. They're not going to see the full benefits of the purchase. And for most suppliers, they're on a journey from just selling simple, low margin, low value products that is kind of transactional product sales to more sticky solution sales. So meaning, multi-year contracts that are more pervasive, that touch more parts of the customer's enterprise. Those kinds of solutions, that entails a lot of risk for the customer, right? It's big difference between buying a product that if you don't like it, you just swap it out for a new product next month versus signing up for a 3-year agreement with product service, additional support layers. That's a really risky decision. It's a very hard decision for a customer to undo. Look, every supplier out there loves talking about transformation. We all love to sell transformation. It's probably like the buzzword of the decade in B2B sales. But transformation is a double-edged sword. It's exciting. It captures the customer's imagination, but it also dials up the risk and heightens their fear that something might actually go wrong. And then they might get fired or just look bad to their boss and to their team and their shareholders, et cetera. So I think it's a little bit of both. Like I think some of these things were here, like the omission bias is just a human bias, but at the same time, the things that create indecision with customers, those things are all on the rise and they're all getting worse.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you touch upon a lot of things that I've been seeing and hearing, on the front lines. And I think, a lot of other people who have been there, I
Mhm,
think about, I mean, as somebody who like works with startups and doing growth marketing and trying to identify
mhm,
from a go-to-market perspective, like how to optimize against three variables, which is like channels, messaging, and audience.
mhm.
You're kind of like, it's like, I think about it always work. It's hip and hype until everybody does it. and then you
Yeah.
got to find the next thing, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
cyclical, right? And I
Yeah.
almost feel like that's also how it kind of works with the psychology of humans to a certain
Hmm.
degree. We rotate through these different emotional triggers
Hmm.
through, and it's all I feel like almost historically it's going to be different surface level like triggers, but the very human component is all deeply rooted to how we behave, how we make decisions through
Yeah.
instinctual behavior, right? And I think what's tugging on that is relative. So some of the
Hmm.
stuff that we're seeing with like crowded information, I see that as obviously, like if you're talking about email and LinkedIn, like that's going to be stadium filled with a bunch of
Yeah.
stuff, right? And but versus, if you find somebody's social media Instagram handle and then you DM them from your personal Instagram, I mean, like there's
Yeah.
different ways of like
Hmm.
playing around with how to get some kind of piece, whatever that message is in front of them.
Hmm.
But that said, like I think about the psychology of like why do those certain things work, right?
Hmm.
And that's a real proof point. But like we found like Instagram and like Facebook DMs to work for a particular type of software.
Hmm.
But um, but I think it also comes down to like, well, that's a way for me to immediately put a face to the name
Hmm.
that is a little bit more personal than if it was coming from email or coming from a LinkedIn where it's
Yeah.
professional environment. And now I'm seeing a little bit sense of vulnerability, even just like psychologically as a consumer or the end user of the interaction.
Hmm.
I'm curious as to like, do you guys ever dig in terms of like deep around like the psychological behaviors of people and I don't know if it's even like kind of like bucketing personality types in terms of like how people interact because obviously when you're selling into an ICP or an account you might
Hmm.
have different buyers involved in that and
Sure.
stakeholders involved in how you're talking to the CFO is so drastically different than how you're talking to perhaps the end user. The ROI that they look at and evaluate is going to be different. CFO is looking at financial return.
Yep.
End user might looking at a time return. So I'm just curious as to like how you guys have.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. Yeah, it's funny you asked about this. Is one. So I give two examples of challenger sale and the jolt effect. There was actually another study we did, which is on exactly this topic. We published a book called The Challenger Customer in 2015, and it dealt with this problem of actually the real problem the book was about is sort of a version of what you're talking about, Chris, which is the growth in buying committees. And I actually think that this is, we wrote the book and we found the average B2B buying committee was like 5.4 stakeholders. And right after we wrote the book, we redid the research and we found it had jumped to 6.8. And it's interesting because a lot of my former research colleagues who are still doing this kind of research at Gartner, they continue to track this. And they said the average buying committee is now in the teens and upwards of like 20
Sounds
plus stakeholders. It's not surprising to salespeople or to entrepreneurs out there. They see this all the time, and I think this is something that's actually been really dramatically accelerated in the last few years with the rise of Zoom and Teams as comprising a bigger and bigger percentage of the sales cycle is happening on virtual platforms. Well, from the customer's perspective, especially if you're talking about transformative solution or a big, huge, risky proposal, they're going to invite like everybody from their side to get eyes on that proposal, to look at the demo, to evaluate the POC result, everything, right? Because they don't want to be the only person blamed if it was a bad decision. They want a lot of other people to speak into it. And the old saying, we hear this all the time, which is when you're dealing with a buying committee, everybody's empowered to say no and nobody is empowered to say yes, right? And so that what ends up happening is that these deals go into committee and you think you've got the customer, they go into committee and they come out with like a lowest common denominator decision, which is let's stay the course, let's not rock the boat, let's avoid disruption, let's save money. Like those are easy things for buying committees to agree to. What they tend not to agree to is the really expensive, risky, disruptive, transformational proposal that you put in front of them. So the study was really about, and the book is really about how do you find the people in the customer organization who can get a typically dysfunctional buying committee to agree on something more than the lowest common denominator. And what we found is, you remember challenger sale, we found there are 5 types of salespeople. We actually found there are 7 types of customer stakeholders out there. And I won't go through all 7, but at the highest level, they fall into 3 buckets. You've got the people we call mobilizers. Mobilizers are the people who are about the big change and the big transformation. They want to pursue right answer, even if it means taking some arrows from colleagues, even if it means cashing in some political chips, even if it's a tough fight and a slog to get the company to agree to it, they know it's right answer and they will fight for it. They're not pro any given supplier, but they're very much pro the big game changing ideas that can really change the direction of the organization. The second category we call talkers, and talkers, as the name suggests, are good for that about that, right? There's a lot of talk. They're friendly people. They love spending time with sellers. They'll introduce you to their colleagues. They'll dish the dirt. They'll give you the inside scoop, etc. But when the arrows or the bullets start flying in that buying committee, they kind of lean back. They don't lean into the debate, right? Because their view is like, the whole team is against it. I'm not going to cash any political chips. I'll break the news to the seller after that. Or more often than not, they'll just say, well, the time isn't right. Let's connect again next quarter. Or let's talk next year. And then the third category is the blocker, and the blocker is kind of the pro status quo person. Usually, in most companies, this is the person who approved the incumbent vendor, or maybe even the person in some cases who helped design the homegrown solution that you're looking to replace. And so they've got a lot personally at stake if you win the deal, or a lot of risks they perceive. But a lot of times these people are like their heads down, they're in execution mode, they're not interested in talking to sellers about their big transformative, game-changing proposal. So these are the three kind of categories, and not surprisingly, what we find is most salespeople kind of go towards those talkers. Why? Because they're easy to talk to. They're friendly. They give you lots of inside information. They walk the halls with you and introduce you to their colleagues. But top sellers and challengers in particular target mobilizers. Now, conversations with mobilizers are tough. Like, they don't care about you. They care about what's the right answer for their company, but they're going to run you through the ringer. It is a tough conversation. And most sellers leave those interactions with the mobilizers thinking, boy, what a jerk. That person didn't buy any. They just poked holes in everything I said. But challengers understand that when they've got somebody like that, if I can convince this person, they've got the wherewithal to go into that buying committee full of people who don't want to do anything and don't want to rock the boat and don't want to spend money and want to avoid risk and minimize disruption. And they can convince that team to do something more than that. Right. So they seek those people out. So the book is really about how do you find those folks? And when you get them, how do you equip them so they go into that buying committee and they get that group to agree on something more than the lowest common denominator? Oh,
Got
one last thing I'll tell you, Chris, and this is because you mentioned like CFOs and end users. It's quite interesting because I think a lot of times I have sellers who will say to me, "Well, my mobilizer is always the CFO, or depending on what you sell, right? My mobilizer is the CTO, or my mobilizer is the head of end user computing, or it's the CMO, whatever it is. Depends on what solution you're selling." But I always caution them by telling them, "Look, the research showed no correlation between box on the org chart, title, or seniority, and likelihood to be a mobilizer." And think
it.
about this for a moment. You could go fight your way into the corner office. You might think, boy, the CTO is my mobilizer, and you fight your way into the corner office. We actually found that even with senior executives, there's about an equal probability, one-third probability that that person will be a mobilizer, talker, or even a blocker. And think about that. You fought your way into the corner office. You fought the good fight. You made your way in there. You got time with that senior executive, and that person is going to talk you to death, and they're not going to stick their necks out and get the buying committee to do more than nothing, right? And so you got to kind of take off your traditional kind of lenses of thinking about stakeholders, seniority, role, title, function, and look for your mobilizer, no matter where they are, right? It may be that they're more junior. It may be that they're an end user. It may be that they're not the typical functional buyer you sell to. I'm not saying ignore those people. You still likely need the buy-in of the CTO, but that CTO may not actually be your mobilizer. Maybe somebody in a different department, a different market, different office, and different level of seniority.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think about, Dropbox as kind of like the originator of like product-led growth and doing that with the end
Yeah.
user until you got
Yep.
enough adopted within the organization that they have to do some enterprise buy-in.
Yeah.
But if you did go to the CTO saying, "Hey, this is the way to do file sharing," you probably would be, hit back with like why and check this
Yeah.
all these different security measures
Yeah.
before you could even
Yeah.
have a conversation, right? So yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely agree with that. I know we're kind of up on time, so I just have one more last question here, and it's
Sure.
a bit
Yeah.
more, maybe a little bit more personal, but given kind of the amount of time that you spent in this space and researching it, is it something that still continues to intrigue you And
Mhm.
and if so, where do you feel like this is taking you in the next couple of years? If not, what other avenues are you looking to investigate?
Yeah, great question. It definitely does. I mean, I feel like only in the last few years have we started to see really serious kind of database research start to
Mm,
be done in sales. So I think it's been, I mean, you have to go back a really long ways to like Neil Rackham's work around spin selling, which was one of the first truly kind of rigorous studies of sales, database studies of sales. There hasn't been a lot in between, but I think more recently we've started to see more interesting work being put out that is more rooted in data and science and research. And I think salespeople are really responding to that. At the same time, I don't think we're done seeing these changes and these wrinkles in the way that customers buy. I mean, for me personally, I find that with all the research we do, we kind of surface more, often surface more questions than answers, if you will. So I've started to spend more time recently. I mentioned that our company spends a fair bit of time working with people who sell themselves, where the person is the product. So law, accounting, investment banking, consulting, et cetera. Where I'm not selling a tangible product or solution, but I'm basically just selling what's between my ears, right? I'm selling my ability to provide advice to the client. Is actually a fundamentally different sale. The professional services market, I think, after healthcare, is like the second biggest industry in the world. But a lot of what we found over the years, whether it's Challenger or Jolt Effect, we found had some application in those spaces, but not exactly the same. It didn't resonate in the same way. And so we went out actually a couple of years ago and we did a large study of professional services, partners in professional services firms, and found an interesting set of profiles. I mean, it had a similar kind of resonance in the market as the Challenger work did many years before in the B2B sales space. We published that work last year in Harvard Business Review. It's or an article if your listeners are interested or if they're in that space. The article was called "What Today's Rainmakers Do Differently." And again, this is one of those industries, one of those professions where there is tons of conventional wisdom and passed down folklore about what it means to become a trusted advisor or to be a rainmaker in your firm. And we found that a lot of those assumptions, especially given the way that clients buy today in professional services, are actually flawed or just outright wrong, right? In need of a wholesale revision. So we've got a new book coming out in the spring, which is going to be about this research. It's called The Activator Advantage, and that comes out in April. So, for me, I think we always find these interesting little wrinkles. We do all this work on B2B sales, and we find that it doesn't really resonate with a huge sector of the global economy. So say, hey, let's go study what works in those spaces as well. So I think there'll be many more questions to answer. We'll be dredging up new ones every day through our research. And so I haven't gotten bored of it in the least. If anything, I get frustrated about the fact that I can only kind of take on one of these big things at a time because there's so many questions out there that are in need of good research.
awesome. Very cool. On that note, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time. It was
Thanks, Chris.
intriguing to talk to you and kind of get your insights from a data perspective. But it was, yeah, it was very interesting.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the invite.